Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Busy day in Canberra. Here's the latest. Here's what's coming up tonight on the program. The High Court have now revealed their reasoning for reversing the 20-year-old precedent on indefinite detention. A decision, of course, that's seen the release of 141 foreigners into the community. Last night, Labor went after Peter Dutton, but today he's actually been proven right, no less than by our nation's highest court. I'll explain what's happened and what needs to now occur in the Parliament in just a moment. A new study shows what you and I have known all along. There's a lot of goodwill amongst Australians for constitutional recognition. But it was the PM's divisive and racist proposal that turned Australians off. More on that later with the wonderful Jacinta Price, and an update too on new corruption claims regarding a prominent Indigenous organisation. Plus, Labor might look more and more incompetent, but they've still got plenty of rat cunning. This move to increase senators from the ACT and the Territory, it's pure politics and all designed to circumvent your vote. And having learnt this morning that a foreign criminal was refusing to wear their ankle monitor and now have gone into hiding, you might think at this time of considerable community concern that the Immigration Minister might be a bit forthcoming. Well, today, not really.
When was the Minister first made aware that after he released 141 hardcore criminals, one of those criminals absconded? Can the Minister inform the House of the nature of this individual's crimes? And does the Minister know where this individual is now?
I should be very, very clear about a couple of things. The first one is he would be well aware, as all members would be well aware, this government does not comment on operational or individual matters.
But first, while the Albanese government is fast shaping up to be one of the most incompetent in recent times, it's certainly got plenty of political rat cunning, like its refusal to release details about how ministers like Richard Marles use the VIP jets that cost taxpayers millions, despite this information being released almost routinely by other governments. Like the tricky way too, they now issue media announcements after ministers have left the press conference so that questions can be avoided. Like yesterday's example involving Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, like we saw too with the Prime Minister and those injured naval divers hurt by a Chinese warship. But all that pales into insignificance when you look at Labor's latest plan to increase the size of the Senate. Because the one thing they've learned from their massive defeat over the Voice is that the only place where they can count on hard left support, come what may, is the ACT. So why not exploit that? Because if the bad polls continue, this is a government that could well end up in minority or out of power altogether. Now, the ACT is the home of woke. Canberra is the city with the highest percentage of public servants and the highest average income in the country, meaning most households there are insulated from the real world. The ACT is the one jurisdiction that voted for a republic back in 1999, and it was the only jurisdiction that voted yes to the Voice in October. Indeed, while the nation voted 60-40 against the Voice, Canberra voted 60-40 for the Voice. So naturally, federal Labor is now looking at giving the ACT an extra 2 senators following a parliamentary committee recommendation, taking it to 4 in the ACT and the NT in total. And while you might think at home, I don't live in Canberra, Peter, I don't care, well, here's why it matters to all of us. Extra senators in the ACT and the Territory are a way of making it easier for Labor governments and much harder for coalition ones to get legislation through the Senate. And that's exactly the kind of manipulation that could be expected from a Prime Minister still smarting from the defeat of an issue he thought he couldn't lose. You see, with 2 senators, the quota for election is 1/3 of the vote, which in the past has always meant 1 senator for each of the 2 major parties, 1 Liberal, 1 Labor from the ACT. But with 4 senators, well, the quota for election is just 20% of the vote. And with the Green left so strong, that means the ACT would likely return 3 left-wing senators and just 1 on the centre-right, making it that much harder for coalition governments to get their legislation through the parliament. It's often forgotten that while governments are formed in the House of Reps, laws need to pass both houses of parliament. And that's why governments, especially the coalition type, can be in office, so can be in government, but not in power, because they struggle to get their legislation through the parliament, even where they've got a clear mandate. Now, a good example here is 2013. Tony Abbott had a mandate to scrap the carbon tax, could not have been a clearer mandate. But Labor refused to back the legislation. In fact, he only managed to get it done with a mixed bag of votes from the crossbench. So you can see the problem here for coalition governments, can't you? Particularly when Labor never respects the voters' mandate. And the more senators for the ACT will just make that problem worse. It's no wonder the Special Minister of State has said, and he would, and I quote, "Look at how quickly we can implement these recommendations." Now, I don't think they're going to do the ones to increase the size of the House of Reps. I think they're just in this report as a smoke screen. The real strategic play here is to give the territories more senators designed to help Labor. As well, we hear the ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr, well, he's rumoured to want to enter the Senate. More ACT senators will mean he can be accommodated without rolling Katie Gallagher. Now, this is a deeply cynical exercise, but this is how Labor rewrites the rules in its favour, and it stinks. And look, that ongoing shambles of foreign criminals, murderers, rapists, pedophiles, all out on the streets, well, it took another turn for the worse today. More emails revealed by my Sky News colleague Andrew Clennell, who'll join me in a moment, show that Labor knew it had a problem and tried to sneak around it by getting the detainee who took his case to the High Court, the man who raped a 10-year-old boy, removed to a third country. But when that move failed, the Albanese government never thought to prepare a plan B. First, the minister said it was not anticipated that there would be a problem. Now, that's, of course, false. She then said that she'd been advised that they would win the case.
You knew this could happen in June, though, didn't you, or did you?
We knew that there was a High Court action on foot. We knew that it was 20 years of legal precedent, and we were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case, that is, allow us to do what we wanted to do, which is keep these people in detention.
That was November 19. We now know from her statement yesterday, after Clennell produced those secret emails, well, that's also false, because once presented with the Clennell emails, she backtracked, and now she's saying there on the 19th of November, she wasn't referring to the legal chances of winning the High Court case. What was she referring to? God only knows. Then Claire O'Neill tried to tell us that legislation was impossible.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works. Then
she was, of course, overruled and told the Parliament, in fact, that legislation was necessary. Then she said that Labor's legislation was the toughest ever.
The person on the Leader of the Opposition loves to present himself as a tough guy on the borders. He never wrote laws as tough as this, Speaker. He never wrote laws as tough as this.
And it wasn't tough. It only lasted a couple of hours before she had to beg Peter Dutton for amendments on mandatory reporting and ankle bracelets. Now, even after all of this, it turned out last week that at least 4 sex offenders had been released by the government into the community without those ankle bracelets.
No, we don't have the authority to monitor people who are lawfully in our community. There's only 4 reportable offenders that we are responsible for to monitor under very stringent conditions, and if they breach their reporting obligations, then we can charge them with an offence and hopefully get them locked back up.
Right.
That's our plan. Right. For those.
They're not, these 4 that you're talking about, they're not under GPS trackers right now.
They're not under GPS trackers.
And today we learn that one of the foreign criminals, one who was supposed to have an ankle bracelet fitted, well, he said, I don't want to wear it. He effectively told the police to get stuffed. And guess what? Well, he's absconded. He's gone to ground. He's at large somewhere, but no one knows where that is. even though we know he's guilty of having sex with an underage person and was considered enough of a risk for the minister to think that a security bracelet was in fact needed. Now, what staggers me is that the government can pass a law to say that someone must wear an ankle bracelet because they're a security risk, but when they are approached by the police and they simply refuse, it would appear there's no further consequences. This is Keystone Cop stuff, but it gets worse. Last night, after the High Court announced it would release its reasons for the detainee decision today, but before anyone had seen those reasons, the government brought more legislation into the parliament, legislation which the opposition, quite rightly, wouldn't support. First, it said we can't support it because it doesn't provide for preventative detention, which Peter Dutton said in the parliament last night was the only way to solve this mess. And secondly, because the legislation would have to be revised anyway in light of the High Court's reasons published today. So don't rush it again, said the opposition. For God's sake, just get it right.
There should be a preventative detention regime as part of this bill, and it should be drafted with haste by the government. And obviously, once the outcome is provided tomorrow from the High Court, it can be, Deputy Speaker, in accord with the advice from the High Court. We said this to the government early this morning. Don't rush this bill. There's no need to suspend standing orders because you haven't properly drafted this bill. There are flaws all through it, and it has no mention of preventative detention whatsoever. And so the ministers who made the grave errors of judgment and embarrassed the Prime Minister in his absence in the last sitting week have been let loose again.
Well, lo and behold, when the High Court released the reasons for that detainee judgment this afternoon, Peter Dutton was right. As the High Court makes clear, the preventative detention regime is about the only way possible to get foreign criminals off the street if there's still concerns about community safety. Today in Parliament, the government then tried to portray Peter Dutton as weak on border protection, having demonised him for years as being too tough and too heartless. Now, what a colossal own goal from a minister and a government who've got no idea how to keep Australians safe. If the minister had any awareness, she'd just resign, but politically, I'd say keep her there. Keep her there as a potent reminder that on border protection, Labor's got no idea and absolutely no ticker. All right, as I said, busy day in Canberra. Not this, plenty of other things too. We'll get the headlines now with Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. The High Court has released its long-awaited reasons for releasing immigration detainees back into the community. The ruling appears to give the green light for the government to impose preventative detention orders. It would open the door to putting some released detainees with criminal records back behind bars.
In this instance, there's no ambiguity, and therefore there can be no more excuses from the government. Now the test for them is, do they have legislation ready to go? They should be able to introduce it into the House tomorrow. It should be able to pass the Parliament this week. We will sit as long as it takes.
One of the 138 people already released is still on the run after evading police monitoring.
All efforts coordinated under Operation Aegis are being made to track down this individual.
Buoyed by the latest news poll result, the opposition leader told the party room today the coalition will return to power after just one term in opposition. Peter Dutton praised unity within the coalition as a factor and teased major policy announcements to come in the new year. Meanwhile, over in the Labor caucus meeting, the Treasurer pledged to hold talks with backbenchers concerned with cost of living support ahead of the mid-year economic update. Also in that meeting, Senator Pat Dodson announced he'll retire from politics come Australia Day, following a long battle with cancer.
I do leave this place with some sense of sorrow in that as a nation we were not able to respond positively to the referendum.
And the families of Israeli hostages have met with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister here in Parliament this afternoon. Earlier on the front lawn, the group urged politicians not to forget the plight of those captured or killed by Hamas in Gaza.
They have the right to live in the country when they can go out and come back home to their mum.
Also today, Labor bowed to coalition pressure, agreeing to ban the Nazi salute federally. The Attorney-General announced the strengthened position, having previously claimed it was a matter for the states. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
As I said, pretty busy. Lots to get through. Joining me now, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew, thank you. We'll start with this High Court decision today, all the reasons. We've had the decision 2.5 weeks ago. Of course, this is the rationale for the decision. I played a grab there last night from the House, Peter Dutton saying, look, the only way forward here is to use the existing preventative detention framework. Clearly, he's been proven right. That's the recommendation from the High Court, sort of in obiter in parts of its judgment. So what's likely to happen now? Will the government put in legislation forthwith?
Well, Claire O'Neill's told the House about an hour ago in a very short statement, quote, "We are moving quickly to finalise a tough preventative detention regime before Parliament rises." So using the term finalise suggests you're talking about getting legislation through. Now, the House is kind of due to rise the end of this week, but the Senate is due to sit next week, and then there's a day set aside next Thursday for the House. So the government's not coming forward with any detail on this, but you'd suspect out of this, particularly given the High Court almost did them a favour by saying it is okay to have a preventative detention regime for some cases, like a child sex offender you think is going to re-offend. It does look like they'll put that in place. There are questions in this place tonight, though, about what sort of test will be required for that, because even the High Court said you'd have to prove there's an unacceptable risk of offending. So that would be a high standard, and it would have to go before a judge. So the government looking like they're going to act. They've flagged previously they're getting advice on it. You're quite right in pointing out the opposition suggested this framework first. But a bit of a surprise today too, Peter, in the High Court reporting its reasons now. It's almost like the High Court itself, the judges, feel some pressure in relation to this. It was only a 30-odd page statement of reasons. The ministers previously said the reasons weren't due until February or March. So I think the High Court's feeling a bit of heat on this too, and they're giving the government and themselves, I guess, in terms of their decision, a way out in terms of continuing to detain the highest risk offenders.
I think they would be mindful too, Andrew. We're going over to the Christmas period. The Parliament, will rise very shortly. It doesn't return until February. So you've got a whole lot of detainees, potentially more out of that extra cohort of 200, out on the streets. No really clear way that you could put them back behind bars if you had to. So I think that's the High Court deciding discretion's a better part of valour and getting on with it, getting that judgment out so Parliament can do something with it. I have to say, I followed you over the last couple of days in particular, and all of those emails that have come out, particularly in relation to the US State Department and others, the one that comes off worse in all of this, right across the board, I mean, Andrew Giles, the Immigration Minister, looks like a bit of a clown, but the person who's just not across her brief is Claire O'Neill. These emails contradict things she told you on your Sky News Agenda program. I think she's a real problem for the government.
Look, I'm surprised the opposition haven't gone harder for her on this point question time, I have to say, Peter. I mean, it's pretty obvious that what she said...
Why would you want her sacked? Why would you want her sacked? I'd keep her there.
Well, I mean, yeah, but there's got to be accountability somewhere along the line. I mean, she wouldn't tell me on Sunday Agenda when she got this so-called advice that they were likely to win the case. These emails, filed to the High Court and picked up by us just because we just decided to go and have a look at the documents. They're clear that in August she's scrambling. She's scrambling like crazy, the minister, or her officials are on her behalf since August 29, to find somewhere else for this guy to go. They tried Saudi Arabia, they tried Bangladesh, they tried all Five Eyes countries, and eventually, on the eve of the state dinner visit of the Prime Minister of the US to Washington, they're trying the US State Department. Well, what happened, what these documents reveal and what the judgment today reveals as well, is the High Court got fed up. They ended up having representations from the government saying we're trying to relocate this guy to the US, so he does have a hope of not being indefinitely detained, and they said, well, the US aren't giving him a home, so he is indefinitely detained, see you later. But one of the emails has an official, a day or two after meeting Claire O'Neill in early September, saying the minister wants this a priority. She wants no stone unturned in resettling this individual. If she said, if she's making out, like she did on Sunday Agenda, that her advice was they were likely to win from that, that is directly and massively contradicting that. Why are they all sending emails on Saturday night, Sunday, as these emails show, and public servants at that, desperately trying to remove this guy? They knew they were going to lose. She didn't tell the truth on it, I don't think.
I don't think she did at all. I think it is blind panic. I think Labor's been caught out. You caught them out with the email, but I think she in particular has been a calamity from where to go on this issue. Talk to me about this Labor-dominated parliamentary committee that's recommending an increase in senators in the ACT and the NT. I mean, they want a whole lot of extra MPs in the lower house. I don't think that's ever going to happen, certainly at least without the population to increase. I think that's just cover, because the senators would be a game changer for the hard left, particularly if this government was to fall into minority at the next election.
Yeah, well, I've heard you say that, and look, it's hard not to come to that conclusion, because what government's ever going to put up 200 MPs for the House of Reps? I mean, yeah, I think you need to change the Constitution for that, but you're never going to get it through, and you're going to look like idiots because no one wants more politicians in this country. The senators thing, like you say, you can say, well, let's just do the senators then, because Canberra's now, ACT's now got 500,000 people and Tassie has 300,000 or whatever. But there's no doubt that self-interest that's governing that, because they always win the Senate seats in the Northern Territory, Labor, and they always win at least one and often two of the ACT seats. And as you say, well, you call it the left or whatever, Pocock is a left-leaning MP, and he's beat out Zed Seselja in the ACT. So there's no doubt the numbers in the Senate for the government will be greatly improved by that change, and they can just do it through legislation, and they'd have a pretty reasonable chance with the crossbench and the Greens and so forth of getting it through. So, yeah, if I was tipping, I'd say that's what's going to happen. I think the opposition will jump up and down, as well they may, but I imagine it could happen and give them a bit of a Senate advantage. The problem for the government at the moment is where the polls are, their first order of priority for concern is the House and retaining government and not being a minority government. And I've got to say, with that news poll the other day, and things can improve for governments, it is mid-term, but people around here, including me, are starting to ponder the situation where with a large crossbench, you could have, say, 68 Labor, 67 Coalition. And imagine that, Peter.
Rat cunning, I tell you, Labor can do that as well as do its cost of living push and all the other things it needs to get back in the news poll territory of positive ground. But we'll see. Well done on those emails, Andrew Clennell. They've been terrific to blow that apart. All right, after the break, that High Court decision, we're going to talk to Michaelia Cash to get the ins and outs. I think it's extraordinary. The government has dodged legislation up until now and then not even got it right. We'll talk to Senator Cash in a moment. We'll also get the latest of the conflict in Gaza. More hostages released, a cessation of hostilities, but horrifically, we've learned today that some hostages, including babies, have been sold to other Islamist terror groups. Welcome back. The High Court's reasons it came out this afternoon behind that landmark ruling to release foreign detainees from indefinite detention all came about regarding a Burmese criminal, NZYQ. And the court found that holding him in detention was beyond the legislative power of the Commonwealth Parliament. In their full judgment, the High Court also green-lighted the use, as we talked about with Andrew Clennell, of existing preventative detention systems for detainees where it might apply, and this is the foreign criminals, where there's concern they have an unacceptable risk of reoffending. Now, I'll note one of the people released already out on detention is now on the run. He refused to wear a monitor. The police presumably walked away. I don't know why they did that, but they walked away. And as soon as they did, off he went. And this shows just how chaotic the whole response from the Albanese government has been to date. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash. Well, Michaelia, give us your take. You've got a legal background, former Attorney General and now, of course, the Shadow. Give us your take on the reasoning that we've had from the High Court today and where we go from here.
Well, Peter, what can you say? Complete, total and utter incompetence by the Albanese government. In the first instance, the case applied to one person. The facts applied to one person. The orders applied to one person. So the Albanese government now needs to tell the Australian people why, when it did not have the High Court's reasons, did it rush to release in excess of now 140 foreign criminals, one which you have rightly pointed out is actually on the run.
Michaelia, can I just jump in there? Because nobody else has put that out there in the media today that I have seen anywhere. So are you saying that your reading of that judgment meant they only had to let the Burmese rapist out? They didn't have to do what they've done and release the 141 or the 140 other people. So why didn't they just wait for the final release of the High Court's reasoning before moving on anyone beyond the original claimant?
And that is a very good question, Peter, because again, High Court decision, one detainee, facts of the case, one detainee, orders in relation to one detainee. They need to tell the Australian people why, absent the reasons for the decision, they rushed to let these people out, because it would appear that they actually put the rights of detainees as they saw them above the safety and security of the Australian people. But in relation to the decision, what does the decision actually say? Well, it green lights what Peter Dutton, James Paterson and the Coalition have been saying from day one. Bring in a preventative detention scheme. And what has the government said? They have been clear. They will not do it because they can't do it. Well, guess what? Paragraph 72 of the High Court's reasons today clearly blow that out of the water, because the High Court itself, and Peter, it's not often the High Court tells a government what it can and can't legislate. But the High Court was pretty clear here, preventative detention, something that Peter Dutton has said from day one this government should have done. So quite frankly, and James Paterson said it himself today, we are ready to go. Bring in the legislation. We will sit until it is passed. It's in the government's hands now. I'm waiting to see what they do, Peter. I don't hold out high hopes.
So if I was cynical here, Michaelia Cash, you could say when the decision was made, before we see the reasons for judgment, which we see now today, when the decision was made and they really were only on the hook to release one detainee, the fact that the government decided they'd release basically the whole lot says to me that Labor, particularly with a hard left flank, is very uncomfortable with the idea of border protection or indeed detention. So they thought, let's just get this issue resolved, let's sweep them all out and blame it on the High Court. But then there's an almighty cry by the Australian public who say these people are some pretty bad foreign criminals, we owe them nothing, why are they on the street, what's the protections for us? And of course, the Coalition has held the government's feet to their fire. As this though has gone on for the 2-week period, we can see how utterly incompetent they have been all the way through. I suspect unless the Coalition did what it did, there'd be no ankle bracelets. There wouldn't even be now this pressure on them put in preventative detention.
Peter, when we were first briefed by Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles, so Peter Dutton, Michaelia Cash, James Paterson, Dan Tehan, I can tell you right now, the initial legislation, they swore black and blue it was as tough as they could make it. Within minutes, we'd identified faults. Within hours, we drafted 6 amendments, which we then handed to the government and said, this makes your legislation tougher. And guess what? They fell over there and then and accepted the amendments. If only they'd listened to Peter Dutton, who, let's face it, That is a man who puts the safety and security of Australians first and foremost. He's spent time in this portfolio. He knows what you can and can't do. He called for a preventative detention regime. Why in God's name didn't the government just say, look, we'll have a crack at it? Because guess what? Paragraph 72, High Court decision, unanimous decision, Peter, it green lights it. In fact, it doesn't just green light it, it almost encourages it.
Yeah, and I played a grab from him last night in the chamber, absolutely making this point well before we obviously have that judgment reasoning released by the High Court. I must say, my colleague Andrew Clennell's uncovered all of these emails, of course, that were filed in court documents that seem to be at odds with what the minister was doing via her department with the US State Department, conversations being held over there in relation to this Burmese individual, and what she was telling the Parliament, what she was telling the Australian public through the media. I have to say, you rarely see such incompetence right across the board here from an individual. Surely she's got to go.
Peter, there are some very serious questions now that Claire O'Neill has to answer. Because if you go to, I think it's around paragraph 63 of the decision, it clearly states there were some accepted facts. In other words, the government agreed something. What did the government agree? It agreed that in May of this year, there was no prospect of removing this person from Australia. That was an agreed fact, which the High Court then clearly states in its judgment, took into consideration. The actions of the minister and the emails that you have now uncovered clearly show why did they agree that fact, send the High Court down a particular path when they were continuing to look for other options. There is a lot that now needs to come out, and I think Claire O'Neill has some very serious questions she now needs to answer.
Just quickly, we're also getting legislation to deal with the issue of a dual citizenship for convicted terrorists. We know that there was again a High Court decision. There's long been a view that the Parliament needs to legislate to fix this up. The government said they'd do it as soon as they got in. It hasn't happened yet. One of the worst criminals, convicted terrorists we have is a guy called Ben Breaker. He's in prison. He's trying to get out on parole. And of course, he has now had, it was taken away by Peter Dutton, he has now had his Australian citizenship returned. I find out last night from James Patterson that in fact, even with the government's draft legislation, should it pass, it's not retrospective. It will do nothing about this bloke, Ben Breaker. Now, surely that also needs to be fixed up.
Oh, look, absolutely. And again, we were briefed on this legislation. And the first question Peter Dutton asked was, does it apply to Ben Breaker? And Claire O'Neill said no. You've got to be kidding me. This is a government that just reacts. It scrambles to put things together and then it fails miserably on so many occasions. Why wasn't the government prepared? In relation to this particular detainee in today's decision, in May of this year, the government should have been preparing for an outcome that it means it could lose. And instead, what's Claire O'Neill saying? Oh, we thought we were going to win. I mean, Peter, governments prepare for the worst and the best case scenario. The same with the Ben Breaker decision, the best and the worst case scenario. This government doesn't seem to prepare at all. Now, that worries me because I come from the side of politics, you come from the side of politics that says the safety and the security of the Australian people is the first and foremost priority of a Commonwealth government. Mr Albanese doesn't have the backs of the Australian people. That should really start to worry Australians because the one thing you want your Prime Minister to have, it's your back.
Michaela Cash, I've got to leave it there. I tell you what, this is going to keep going on and on and on, but well done.
It's a long way,
We're getting
Peter.
into a position that we might see some legislation. Thank you. Or after the break, the study that says most of us have got a lot of goodwill for Aboriginal people. We just did not like the voice proposed by the PM, but he's still pushing on with a treaty. And Linda Burney wants her regional voices as well. And a land council in administration. After the break, the wonderful Jacinta Price. Welcome back. Now to the Prime Minister's response to the results of that October 14 voice referendum. Other world events have intervened, but it is incredibly important that we tie this off and know where we're going. A new study out today by the Australian National University has found 87% of voters, they believe, say that Indigenous Australians should have a voice or a say over matters affecting them, and 76% of no voters, says the ANU, think that Aboriginal people are deserved a voice on key policies and political decisions. A co-author of the study, Nicholas Biddle, says our findings suggest it's not so much the premise of recognition, but the model that was being presented to voters at the referendum that failed. Joining me now to discuss this, the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, the wonderful Senator Jacinta Price. I have to say, Jacinta Price, we have missed you here on Credlin. I'm delighted to have your company as always. When I read those findings, that accords with my sense of goodwill amongst Australians for better outcomes for Aboriginal people. I think I disagree with Nicholas Biddle that those sorts of results mean voters want a voice. I think they're saying they want Aboriginal people to have a say, sure, but they want the voice to be people like you in the parliament in a way that all Australians are represented and we're not divided by race. What do you think?
Look, I'd have to agree, Peter. I think the conversations that I have, the overflowing comments and emails and correspondence that I receive suggests to me that Australians certainly did not want the voice proposal that the Albanese government had put on the table, but they do want ways forward, particularly for our most marginalised. I don't agree that they are seeking a sort of another voice model, but perhaps more so that this government should be listening to those voices that they completely ignore, who have answers to a lot of the problems that currently exist already. That's how I see it. They want a practical way forward for Indigenous Australians and no more separatism.
What's disappointing is, in that immediate week after the referendum result, the Prime Minister basically dodged any accountability. He wouldn't tell us if the Makarrata Treaty Commission was coming off the table, given the voice result. He dodged and hid behind the fact that Aboriginal leaders were in a period of mourning. And then obviously he was overseas and world events intervened. But surely Australians have got a right to know, is he still pushing on with the treaty?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, the states are now showing that they're a bit wobbly on their legs with regard to negotiating treaties, which is fair enough. We shouldn't be negotiating treaties with our own citizens. And I think it's a bit of a dog's breakfast if the Prime Minister decides to move forward with this negotiation process. Again, people want action. They want action now. They don't want in the form of treaties, this idea of truth-telling. We want the truth to be told, basically, with a lot of the issues that our marginalised face.
Oh, I'll get to some of those issues in a moment. There's a court case involving young people, but I know you've had a lot to say in the Parliament about land councils. We've seen today the Burnarong Land Council, which is a great part of southern Victoria. It's been placed into administration in September because there's been an investigation of alleged fraud in excess of $150,000 and a whole lot of allegations of mismanagement and corruption. Now, you're going to say to me, I know, this doesn't surprise you, does it?
Oh, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's another very adamant reason as to why we need an audit of the structures that currently exist to determine who's actually appropriately dispersing funds or using funds to provide practical outcomes and who's not doing that. The Australian people want to know. Certainly those that miss out are those that these land councils are supposed to serve. They're the ones that miss out when this sort of behaviour is found. And I don't believe that there's enough in terms of deterring this kind of behaviour because we see it repeated over and over again. I think an audit would provide the opportunity to look at the extent of the issue more broadly, but also what measures should be put in place to deter this sort of thing in the future. And look, as was revealed in the whole debate about the voice, you've got
almost $40 billion coming out of governments around the country year in, year out for Aboriginal people, programs and individual funding. And of course, we know, well, I've been out to your community, Little Sisters and elsewhere, it doesn't hit the ground, does it? So where does it go? Where does it go?
Well, that's exactly right. We need to understand where it goes and we need to reinvest it where it should be providing outcomes. We also need to look at economic independence for Indigenous Australians and move away from this separatist model. You go out to a remote community, if you want to see socialism at play, go out there. It's happening before us. There's dependence on government, on welfare, and we need to create economic opportunity out in those communities and start treating them like small country towns instead of socialist enclaves. But there's a whole raft of things that I'd love to get my teeth into going forward.
Just quickly, we've seen a New South Wales Supreme Court decision that allowed 2 Aboriginal kids, or lately recognised as Aboriginal kids, to be adopted by their long-term foster parents. The Aboriginal mother has said, the white fellas won't understand culture. The court said, look, we're quite happy with the situation. We think they will. We also hear today an 18-year-old man has been allowed also to be adopted by his long-term foster parents. Surely, are we turning the tide here, Jacinta? Are we starting to see that it's got to be about what's in the best interest of the child rather than Aboriginal culture?
Oh, look, I'm relieved to see these sorts of determinations where the best interest of the child has been put before the ideological notion that their culture and connection to country is more important than upholding their human rights. These children finally, the 18-year-old has been fighting to be adopted by those that have loved him and cared for him and nurtured him. In terms of the younger children, it was only recently that they found out that there was any Aboriginal ancestry. So, how can you argue that it's a cultural thing? The only people I know that are still connected to traditional culture are those in remote communities in the Northern Territory, Western Australia and other places. But what we need to do is create well-rounded adults who can find out for themselves more about who they are when they are in a stable position as adults who are got great lives, contributing to society effectively, not gone down the path of incarceration or alcohol and substance abuse and addiction because they've been left in dysfunction. I'm glad to see the tables are turning, and this is a great outcome going forward.
See, I told you we missed you. I know my audience is cheering. I could hear them cheering right now. Jacinta Price, great to have your company as always. We're coming up, President Biden's snub of the UN COP climate conference. Justice Chris Bowen's flying out. Those hostages, including young children, sold by Hamas to another terror group in Gaza. And a whole lot of dates out today for the presidential debates, the hot debates as we enter the 2024 presidential year in the US. Welcome back. Let's get in my panel now. A whole lot of international stories I want to cover. Joined as I am every Tuesday by former Labor MP Michael Danby and Sky News contributor Kosha Garda. Michael, let's just start with the cessation or the continuing cessation of hostilities. We won't call it a formal ceasefire because you assume there'll be a resumption somewhere. We've had 62 Israeli hostages released. We've got about 117 is the latest number of Palestinians. But let's be clear, these are not Palestinian hostages. Some include a woman, we both talked about her in the break, who was a would-be suicide bomber, only she wasn't successful, but she's injured Israelis.
I expect this exchange with the hostages to go on. There's an injunction central to Judaism called Redeeming the Captive, and they will do this for the next 3 or 4 days. But Hamas has got itself in a trap. When they don't deliver any more hostages, the entire spectrum of Israeli opinion wants the government and the army to go after Hamas and dig them out of South Gaza. If they don't deliver those people...
the Israeli opinion hasn't sort of softened on this? No.
Not at all from what I can work out. I mean, all the military people in particular that I've been reading very strong on this, and Hamas have got themselves in a trap. It's very nice for the international apologists of what happened to say that there should be a ceasefire, but they don't take into account that the people who are affected by this are not listening to them. They are the ones who don't want this to happen again and again. They can't. No state, the third the size of Tasmania, can tolerate this happening again and again and again.
I'll just quickly put a photo up on the screen. This is the Bibas family. They include a 10-month-old baby. They'll not be released from Hamas captivity because after they were kidnapped, we're told they were transferred, they were sold to another terror group in southern Gaza. So this is the sort of, it's horror, it's absolute horror that it's been visited upon Israeli citizens. We saw that letter today, as we should, a whole lot of organisations. I mean, if these woke corporates can go out there and stand for the voice, they can stand for the anti-Semitism that's infecting Australia. I thought that was really heartening to see, Kosher. But I guess, you know, this is a civilisational moment for the West.
It is, and I think what's happened as a leadership on the left, just as a generalisation, is walking a tightrope here. If you look at the Prime Minister here and his counterparts everywhere else, where he's on the back of 40, 50 years of this coalition of the fringes that have very little in common, and then every so often you see these issues bubble up. This is a civilizational fight, and it's very difficult for him or others in the leadership to fight that. I always talk about there's two layers of what's fomenting this unrest right now, the civilizational battle. At the bottom, the core layer is really just the demographics and the fabric, which is a direct consequence of immigration policy, for better or for worse. There's good that comes of it. There's other things that come from it, strife, and that's, you know, part of it. And the other piece is sort of what's shaping public opinion between the media and the university sector. So this letter is an example of fighting back on the public shaping, but the underlying foundation of just the reality of the fabric of the country is harder to battle, and I think that's where the civilizational fight is going to come into.
And just quickly, Michael, this is where we're seeing results like we saw it with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, aren't we?
And the softening of opinion in Australia. I can't believe that all around the world, these demonstrations, these violent demonstrations, these anti-Semitic demonstrations, these river to the sea demonstrations aren't affecting normal people, regular people in Middle America, in Middle Australia, in Middle Britain. And I think they're just helping the right of politics and sometimes the harder right of politics.
Yeah, and I think they are. I do think they're impacting on ordinary people. They're not necessarily sure how they signal their support, but they're definitely not with the left. Just quickly, we heard some dates came out today in relation to presidential debates. 2024 US presidential election year. What can you tell us?
I think the saga continues, and it really is unprecedented.
It is like days of our lives, isn't it?
And it's, you know, buckle up for the year ahead. I think, you know, when I look at the dynamic, what's different and what's really, I guess, interesting is one adjective I'd use for this is you've got the by and large front runner on the Republican side facing 4 indictments and realistically could end up in prison, whether it's legitimate or not. That's just something unprecedented, the legal aspect interfering in the election system. And then you have this whole concept of the third party candidate, which is really on the rise, and you know they'll never win, but they could be a spoiler in a country that's so divided.
Who will they spoil more?
And that's the question. So you've got RFK Jr., you've got Jill Stein, you've got, you know, potentially Joe Manchin, you've got Cornel West. There's all these players, and you don't know. It's really difficult to predict who they're going to spoil. And in a country that divided, where the margin of victory is going to be 1 or 2 percentage points, it can make a difference. And so it's anybody who's prognosticating how this will go is not being honest.
And the Republicans, just quickly.
The Republicans, I mean, Trump remains 40, 50, 60 points ahead. I think the battle is for second place, really, and like a far away second place.
And who could be his running mate?
Well, his running mate, I think he's leaving that open. It might be a wild card. I don't know.
What about the governor of West Virginia?
We'll leave it there.
Trump's running mate.
Okay.
We'll get into that next week. Michael Danby, Kosher Carter, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night back here at 6. Here's Andrew Bond.